Call the meeting to order. Thank you for everybody for coming out tonight. Can I get a motion to adopt the agenda as presented? Unless there's any additions or deletions? No, we're good. So can I get a motion to adopt the agenda as presented?
I'll motion that.
All those in favor? So carried. 4.1, 2026 operating and capital budget.
Through Mr. Mayor, I apologize for my raspy voice. I have a bit of a cold, but I'll get through tonight's budget presentation. I was quite upset because this is actually usually my favorite presentation of every year that I do this with clients, and I used to do this back when I worked with municipalities. The reason why it's my favorite presentation is there's so much value in a municipal budget. This is really where council leadership comes together. It's where we create accountability. In a sense, it's where the magic happens, and I say that with complete seriousness. Budgets are where we put resources to people cutting grass. It's where we put infrastructure on the road. It's where we make decisions in relationship to value that we want to provide for our residents. And I think in the case of Gibbons, it's also where we start to correct things and get us into a position of long-term financial sustainability. And so we're going to have a long conversation this evening, and I'll unpack some information for you tonight that will start setting the table for, I think, long-term success for the town of Gibbons. It's also going to be a bit of a discussion around, and again, I kind of thought of what type of tagline do I want to put on this year's budget. It's basically resetting for resilience, to start setting us up for success, to help support basically maybe the hurt that's occurred within this community over the last number of years, and probably most importantly, really kind of create a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel so we can get some positive, kind of thoughts around where we're going to go. And I think this budget will start to provide that. And so with that, I'm going to kind of get going into the details of the information. Of course, it doesn't work now. We tested this, but it is typical for Tim. Nothing works when it comes to technology. The laser's working. Let me just check. Oh, no, okay. Why would it work before and not now? Okay, there we go. Okay. So the first thing, this is a slide, believe it or not, that I came up with when I was presenting budgets in Strathcona County, literally in the early 2000s. I used to sit and I'd wonder about, well, how do I explain a budget to a council that's really meaningful and to the public to really kind of put down, in a sense, what this whole complex plethora of information that we're going to be sharing with you, how does it really describe what a budget does for a municipality? And in a sense, we really provide one product as municipalities, as complex as we are. And that is to provide quality of life for people each and every day. I often think to myself, what's the most important business in the world? And I think it's municipal government. We provide safety, we get people to work, we provide economic development. We support people's, well-being with things like recreation and those types of support types of things. And really, in a sense, we're in the business of creating memories for people. This is where their families grow and where they thrive. And so we provide quality of life. And how do we do that? We do that through services. And those services are things like clearing snow, cutting grass, fixing roads, creating economic development, creating opportunities for people. The other side of that equation, though, is, of course, we have to charge for those things just like any business. We are a business, and we do that through taxes, utility rates, fees, and charges. And one of the things that's very important in the municipal equation is that we are not a for-profit business. So as we go through the numbers, as we're going to go through tonight, it's very important to note for our public that when we put together a budget, we work very diligently on making sure that we're efficient, that we're effective, but at the same time we're fair. And there's no profit going into anybody's pockets. There's no bonuses going home with staff. It's really, in a sense, in my mind, a very pure business in terms of being kind of connected with the community. Taxes, utility rates, and future charges are basically a cost-through endeavor. We charge what exactly the cost is for our services. Now, there are reserves we'll explain later, and that is where some of the money goes. But again, in a sense, it's a pretty pure business. And again, it's all about providing quality life for people. Can you just move the slide ahead, Chris? For some reason, it just seems to want to die. I'm not sure why. Thank you. Now, one of the things that is really important in a budget is it's really about, no problem. It's really about understanding what does quality of life mean from a livable perspective. And if you've never heard, and for the public, there's this McLean magazine that comes out every year, and it talks about the top 100 municipalities in Canada from a livability perspective. And I was really curious about that, so I did a little bit more digging. I wondered, well, what do they actually rate that on? And this is the criteria that I was able to find, and I put in a slide that I developed for my classes. And it really comes down to basically 14 things: governance, housing, neighborhood, access to green space, safety, transportation. I'm not going to go through all of these, but this is really what people value. And normally what happens in a typical municipality, and I don't mean that Gibbons isn't typical, is that there's a strategic planning exercise that councils go through usually right after the election. And this is the type of stuff that I talk to and about with councils. And what the goal is to find out, well, what does the typical resident in your community really value from a livable community perspective? And once we've identified that from a strategic perspective, we'll develop goals, we'll develop objectives, and really, in a sense, we'll develop a vision for the community. What does this mean, and what do we want to be in the future? And when you do that, then the key component is then developing a budget. Nothing really happens of any meaningful and tangible action in relationship to municipality without basically putting some type of financial resource or human resource to basically making something happen. And that's where the budget's all about. And so developing a livable community, when we look at this in terms of what you as council really want to see for your community, it really comes down to making decisions in the budget. What type of financial resources are we going to put towards action? What type of people resources are we going to put towards action? When we do that, then eventually we start serving the community with, again, better services, better economy, maybe new business, whatever it might be. And that's the goal that we have as we start to develop and discuss the budget information with you this evening. The second component, and again, this is where I get a little bit more granular, I am also a very practical person. As I said before, I was a budget officer for many years of my career before I became a CAO and then a GM of Community Protective Services, so I take the money very seriously. And in that, I created this concept, as I was completing budgets. And it comes down to this, is that from an operating perspective, we have what's called the operating equation. And that means that in any budget, as we look at all these, kind of really complex numbers, it comes down to about 6 key things that are in that budget. We take care of core services: snow clearing, emergency services. We maintain roads. These are the basics of any municipality, any community, to be able to deliver municipal service. We also create what's called value-add services, and so this is kind of like the shine on the diamond. So things like library services, recreation, trails, parks, family community services programming. These things are essential in many communities, but they are all also a choice. So again, we can't live without water, we can't live without sewer, we can't live without roads, but in a sense we can live without some of these things. But I will say this, that as our municipalities have evolved over time, value-add services have become and considered essential as well. And so I don't want to minimize these in any way, but it is important to note that as we start looking through budgets, value-add services are kind of the over and above that makes our community special in my mind. We then have asset maintenance, and so from a capitalization perspective, I'm not going to get into TCA and details, but there are basically, when we have capital projects that are basically capitalized, and then we have basically asset maintenance. So we can basically take care of the cracks in the road, we fix up our vehicles, we fill potholes, and that's get operationalized. And so these are things that we have to do each and every year to maintain our assets so that we can maintain services. But at the same time, our capital assets are at risk of basically failure. And so asset maintenance is a very important part of operations as well. We then have special projects, so there might be special projects that occur. Again, we might have, basically studies that are done. Maybe we want a new rec facility. Maybe we want to look at things like, again, something we're looking at now, fire regionalization. We might want to look at maybe what does a new community hall look like, or whatever it might be. And those are special projects that occasionally work their way into operating budgets of municipalities. We then have reserve transfers. I'm going to speak about this in a little bit more detail later. One of the keys, and this is a challenge for Gibbons right now, is that one of the keys of a viable and sustainable municipality is to plan for your future. And that means that you should have essentially, just like in your personal life, a little bit of money in the bank to take care of things like if the roof caves in your house, or the car breaks down, or you're paying for your kid's school, whatever it might be. Municipalities, in a sense, aren't all that different. We have to plan for future maintenance of our roads. We have to plan for the uptake of our facilities. We have to plan for contingencies such as fire, floods, whatever it might be. So having money in the bank is essential to the sustainability of a municipality. You don't know what you don't know. And again, I've worked with many municipalities over my 30 years in the business where, reserves and future planning hasn't been done very well. And when something comes up, they're left in a situation of financial challenge because of that. And so reserves is a very key component of, again, the operating equation, something that's going to be very important in our discussions as we move forward from a long-term financial planning perspective together. The other and final piece of the municipal operations component in an operating budget for municipalities is debt servicing. Again, this is interest on debt because from an operational perspective, this is something that's considered an expense, and again, a necessary component of basically municipal government. Debt is something that the town of Gibbons is challenged with right now. And again, we've been very transparent with our public. We're near our debt capacity. And I want to say before we get into the detail of the budget that debt is not a bad thing. Debt, if used properly, can actually help support municipalities in many ways with growth, with supporting the sustainability of our infrastructure, with replacement of things like ice plants in our hockey rinks, with replacement of our roads and maintenance of our roads. But the reality is when you take out debt in a bad way, especially if it's used for operating costs, it is what I consider bad debt. And that's the situation that Gibbons is in today, where we have approximately $6 million in operating debt. And again, we're near our maximum debt capacity. So again, that is a consideration and a problematic issue. So from an operating equation perspective, we're looking to right size and fix the situation, certainly with this budget. But at the same time, two issues we have from the operating equation perspective is we have an issue with reserves in that we don't have any, and we have an issue with debt in that we're at only near the maximum. So these are two long-term considerations that council's going to have to debate and discuss and give us direction on as we start to unravel the challenges that we have going forward. The capital equation, again, very similar. We have to, again, balance. It's always about balance. And the balance in capital is also very important. One thing that I forgot to mention, but I'll mention it now, is that, and again for the public, is that balanced budgets are mandated and legislated to always be balanced. So the operating budget and capital budget on the Municipal Government Act must be balanced every year, and that has been problematic for the town of Gibbons, and it won't be a problem going forward with the information that we're going to be presenting with you tonight, but it is something that we want to make sure that our public's aware is that unbalanced budgets are actually legislatively incorrect, and so that's something that we're looking at correcting now. Now, again, capital equation is very similar to the operating equation in that, again, we have to balance, and we have things like annual projects, rehab, replacement, growth capital, direct and indirect. And what I mean by that is direct growth capital are things like roads, water, and sewer to bring growth in. And then indirect is when the people are here. Then we have growth capital like having to invest in a new fire hall or having to invest in a new fire truck or maybe some vehicles to help maintain or a grader because we have more roads to take care of. And so there's basically the capital to bring the people in, then there's the capital that you need once the people are here. So that's the difference between growth and indirect growth capital. We then have value-added capital. Again, as I mentioned before, value-added capital are things like libraries, recreation facilities, and those types of things. And I've been involved in a lot of builds on recreation, library, and gymnastics facilities and things like that over my career. And I think they're wonderful for the community. So never underestimate how important that capital is for our communities. And it really does create a great footprint for our communities. and so moving along. And then there's strategic capital, so investment in things like growth, say for example, roads, water infrastructure into the industrial heartland would be strategic, and that we're looking at attracting basically, high end type of growth and that type of a thing from an industrial perspective. And so very important things. The key thing in the concepts here that I want to get across as we start to get into the detail of the budget is that we have to have balance, which means that you cannot plan for expenditures from an operating perspective nor a capital perspective unless you have funding sources that are equivalent and equal to those sources. Before we get into any of the detail, I will state this, is that we've worked very diligently to provide you with a balanced operating budget with real challenge, and we're going to share more about that here shortly. The capital budget, I have no problem saying we're going to be looking at pretty much a moratorium on capital, probably for 2026, because we just don't have the money to pay for anything. And we certainly would not be recommending additional debt. And we need to be careful moving forward, and so it's going to be basically what we must do, but there's not going to be anything in terms of like what we could do or any wants and needs in this capital budget this year.
Jim, can I just interrupt for a second? Just
Absolutely.
reset our camera?
Yep, for sure. The back of my head's not showing up very well. Is that the problem? Real man. We're fixing this.
We just need to make sure that's gonna go up on our live stream,
Okay, no problem.
which I don't think it is, but they can still hear you.
Okay.
That's what we got, that's what we got.
Okay. One of the things that's very important, and again, to give council some confidence in the numbers that you're about to see, is that, the Bloom way of an approach to budgeting, we've been doing a lot of this over the years, and I learned this from an incredible mentor of mine, George Hybricks, who I worked with many, many years ago. He talked about these principles. Again, I documented them, but he was the one who really pushed this, and he said, every time we do a budget, we have to make decisions with a long-term perspective. So if we make decisions today, we have to think about how's this going to impact our community tomorrow, from both a service perspective and a financial perspective. And so we were very careful that when we made decisions in this budget, that we were also thinking about what is it going to mean for tomorrow as well. We looked at linkage to broader organizational goals, and again, you as council, we're going to speak about those in a few moments, but you did give us very strong direction about how you felt about services, service levels, about what you want to achieve, and so we worked very hard to align this budget with council's direction. Again, we consider outcome-based decision-making, and so again, one of the things that we did, we're not decision makers. We are basically the people that bring information forward for council to make decisions, and I want to make sure that's very clear to this public, is that there is going to be a significant change in the approach in Gibbons, and that the administration is not leading, council leads. And so we've worked very hard to set a budget up to ensure that the decisions are made by council, that the information we're sharing with you is very transparent, and that basically we will follow the decisions and basically the direction that you make during this process to ensure this budget is basically a council-driven budget and a public-driven budget rather than an administrative decision budget. The other principle is, again, evidence-based decision-making. We want to make sure that we ensure that when we look at anything in relation to the budget, whether it's basically service level adjustments, decisions on capital, decisions on departmental restructures, whatever it might be, we've done homework on basically evidence to make sure it's the right decision. And so not kind of just making decisions, on the fly, or my opinion is basically looking at best practices, what other municipalities do, what are the right policies that we should have in place to make decisions. We did our best to ensure that we used our experience and also kind of tied it to best practices to make sure that everything in this budget is tied to evidence, so the decisions being made are well thought out and have a foundation of correctness as we move forward. The other principle, again, and this is the one that, again, I have to echo and I give council a lot of credit for, is to have effective communication with stakeholders. You've had that and given us that mandate as your administration team, to be very, very open with your stakeholders, meaning your public. wanting to be very transparent, and so we wanted to make sure that we made sure everybody was aware that the budget process was going on this evening. We're trying to put the information together that in a way that's very transparent, and again, maybe to speak to this, we're also planning an open house after the budget's passed to share with the public exactly the decisions that have been made, how we made them, and what's the detail within the budget, so people are aware of what we're doing going forward. And then the final part of the operating budget principle is to make sure that staff engagement has been included, that it can be motivating for staff, and that, again, this is about council leadership. This is about making this place, a well-run municipality, that the staff are respected and appreciated, but at the same time, that they're also accountable. And they have to understand that, there's some expectations around the way that we're going to be doing things forward. And again, I think that was something that we very much looked at as we're putting this budget together to ensure that the proper controls were in place, proper accountability was in place, and this budget would be transparent with council, not just during the budget process, but after, when we're actually looking at reporting going forward during the year as well. The final piece for me, because I can be a long-winded guy, as everybody knows, and then I'm going to pass it over to Ryan, who's the real brains behind all this. It has to be said that this budget is, in a sense, a springboard to a much more challenging situation. This is the beginning, not the end, and this is the first part of what I would call the long-term tax strategy. And long-term tax strategies have three elements: capital strategy, operating plan strategy, and then restricted surplus strategy. There's my voice, it's going now. That's essentially reserves. I will say this, in the case of Gibbons right now, it's very hard for us to do any long-term capital planning strategy because, again, we're at the management of our debt capacity and we don't have any reserves in place. And so we have to probably put kind of a pump the brakes attitude on capital for now. In terms of restricted, unrestricted surplus reserves, we need to start thinking about this. But again, that has to tie to balancing our budget. And so this budget has been primarily focused on basically the operating plan strategy so that we can generate enough funds from an operating perspective and get things right sized from a financial perspective so that we can start generating enough surplus funds that we can start putting money in the bank again and start getting reserves in place and possibly paying down debt. And so the long-term tax strategy certainly will eventually tie into capital, will eventually tie into restricted and unrestricted surplus and reserves. But right now, what you're going to find this evening's discussion is going to be primarily focused on is right-sizing the operating budget and that strategy to kind of get us into a good place. Once we have that covered, then we can start thinking about the other elements of a long-term tax strategy, and so that's where we're at. I will say this, probably the most difficult financial situation I've seen in my career, and I've seen some difficult ones. But I will say this as well, is that I now have a sense of optimism that I surely didn't have maybe 2 or 3 months ago in council. Might remember me panicking a little bit after Christmas when we saw a few things that we'll talk about tonight, and I had talked with Ryan. But I will give Ryan a lot of credit and the rest of the Bloom team, and again, obviously council credit. I think you'll find tonight that we've come up with some very, very innovative, but also difficult and challenging ways to support basically getting us back on side. It's not, again, not a solution in a sense, but it's a beginning to a long-term solution. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan to finish off the budget presentation.
Can you guys hear me? Perfect. Okay, so one of the most important slides I find, on top of all the ones Tim's already gone over, is our property tax disadvantage. And as we have a colleague from the province here, I know he's going to plug his ears for this conversation. So one of the big challenges we have as municipalities is our revenue toolbox, we call it. So we basically, like Tim alluded to, have 3 places that we can generate revenue: property taxes, fees and charges, utility rates. When we compare that to the federal and provincial governments, they have a significant advantage in what they can charge revenues on, and also the fact that their increase in revenues is tied to income tax changes. So as you earn more money, they make more money off of it. So it's very challenging for us to justify and be able to do everything on the municipal level when we compare ourselves to the federal and provincial governments in that way. So just something always that I mentioned to keep in mind as we work through this is the challenge we face as a municipality and justifying every change we make. When you compare it to the federal and provincial, they have a much easier time of going about it. So I wanted to do a tax rate comparator just for the region. Normally we'll do a regional and a similar municipality comparison. Obviously didn't have enough time to get all of that done, so I wanted to do the regional tax rate comparisons. We've got our residential tax rates here in a bar graph, so you can see Bon Accord, Redwater, both above 10. Legal and Gibbons are pretty much the same around the 8 mark, and then you've got your counties. Now I use Thorhild County because they're very similar in the area, and they're kind of the closest county, I guess I would say, to what the towns are like around here. And then we've got our Sturgeon County comparator as well too. So I should note these are the tax rates or the mill rates that are on the tax rate bylaw. Non-res paints a little bit of a different picture, but fairly similar still. One thing I wanted to note is if you look at the Thorhild County residential tax rate at 4.2, this is where they make up the vast majority of their differences. Their non-res rate is significantly higher. The one thing I should note too is they're literally right on the 5-to-1 cusp, which is the province's mandate. So they are very, very taking advantage, I guess you could say, of the targeted to the non-res assessment at that point. So Bon Accord Legal, same kind of thing, quite high mill rates on the non-res side, so around 18 to 19, and then we're right in the middle of the other smaller regional comparators. We're at about 15, and then Redwater is 12.6. So again, these are 2025 numbers. Some of them have changed, but most places don't get their tax rate bylaws out until May generally. So we're using 2025 comparators for this. So then the last piece before we get into the meat of everything is the comparative view. So I was only able to find an approximate average residential property. So we're using a number of $396,000 for what we consider the average residence. So using the 2026 number with the budgeted tax dollar increase, it equates to $33.59 per year, so $280 a month. And the difference that results on this average property for a 4.89% tax dollar increase is $156 per year or $13 a month. When you compare that again, you see all the municipal services we get, and then again, just a theoretical comparison is how much are you paying a month for your cell phone bill? How much do you pay for your insurance? All that kind of thing. So that's all of that. Any questions? Anything we want to talk about before we start heading into sort of the heavy numbers from here? Anything from council?
I'm just wondering, so that's just our rate, right?
Correct.
Because we also collect the Alberta tax and homeland housing on top of that.
Correct.
Do we know the numbers on that by any chance? Sorry.
I just have the forecast numbers generally. What I can say is the ASFF requisitions that I've seen so far are jumping up quite heavily, but I don't know exactly how much yet until we get our numbers from them. On the other ones, the homeland housing I don't think is changing heavily. I think that one's staying fairly static. So that requisition won't change too much, but the school foundation one will change heavily.
So do we know what that impact will be to our residents? Because it's 16 or 19%, isn't it?
If I may, one thing just for awareness, it's a process piece just for this evening. I'm going to run and grab my notepad. Any questions that you ask, if we don't have the answer, we will document and we'll have them back for the next.
Thank you very much. Sorry to spring that on your end.
Anything else from anyone? No? Awesome. Okay, so we'll go into kind of the process. It's obviously going to be a very fast breeze through of everything we've done over the last couple months and the changes we've made. So I guess the big starting number that we had that I talked about from the get-go was the challenge we had in what the actual real deficit was within the budget. So obviously there was a $334,000 budgeted surplus according to the budget that existed. When we normalized, made the changes, fixed everything, for the most part, then the actual required difference that needed to be made up was $2.5 million. So We definitely had our work cut out for us. We went through a very significant amount of changes, adjustments. The province came to the table quite handily with some deferrals, specifically on the loans to local authorities, which I brought to the meeting last time. So, we had quite a bit of change that happened there. So we ended up bringing it down by the $1.54 million, which was 40% of our difference. I should say, the $2.55 million is a massive 66% increase. So this change brought us down by 40%, down to 26%. So our budget base that we needed to make changes to after we did all the corrections, got the deferrals, everything all accounted for, was just over $1 million. So the remaining 26% of what our tax increase would be. So, as noted, budget pressures that we had and faced couldn't be resolved through taxation alone. So, next steps from that was to take it into our services adjustments. In the last couple meetings, we brought forth a significant number of service changes and recommendation for reductions. So, I'll talk about most of these at a high level, and then I can answer some questions if, further from there. Starting with rec and facility, so we've sort of budgeted for a gymnasium service approach change, which would be to reduce the number of casual employees we have and institute a fob system to allow for a reduction in the people oversight. Obviously, there's some limitations to that, so it's not fully fleshed out, but numbers-wise, we were able to achieve a $40,000 reduction there. We've targeted an arena summer shutdown. So again, standard for most of the small municipalities outside of several that do operate for the summer, which is a wicked service to have, but obviously not something that's realistic for Gibbons at this point in time. So that was a budget savings of $132,000. And then we've got some recreation and parks restructuring that we're doing with the overall staffing changes. So that was about $170,000 savings there. Community services and FCSS. So we took a look at the programs, right-sized the programs in the short term. So there was quite a few reductions there, but they can be temporary reductions. So they're things that we are going to look at knocking off now, but we can slowly rebuild and get the services that are being provided by FCSS back up to where they were previously. The one thing I will say is your FCSS department was well over and above what's provided in most of the regional areas. So really, again, a really excellent service to have, but something that in our current situation, obviously we can't maintain. So we'll have to make some changes in there. So we've recommended a bunch of changes, which resulted in a $75,000 reduction. Restructuring again, so that was a $50,000 change. We've eliminated, again, for the short term, the Communities in Bloom program. So that's beautification, for lack of a better term, doing the flowers around town, that kind of thing. So $28,000 savings there, and then some further restructuring in the Community Services Department for another $90,000. Public Works adjustments, we had some big ones in here. So we had some road maintenance reductions. Now, again, not something we want to long-term eliminate, but something that we can eliminate in the short term to achieve balance, and then look at reintroducing what we build back in. So this is things like line painting, crack sealing, asphalt repairs. Now, what I will say is this is a reduction, not an elimination. So some of those programs are still happening. Some of those things are still going on. We've just reduced the amount so that it's not necessarily proactive, but more on what needs to get done on a regular basis. Vehicle maintenance reductions, again, same kind of thing. No or limited proactive maintenance and repairs. Purely just setting aside funds to keep the equipment going in the short term, and looking at how we reintroduce that again in the future. There were some water replacement reductions. So we had forget how many, 65 budgeted water meter replacements, I think. So we knocked that number down quite significantly, again, just to be reactive on the water meters that need to get replaced. We did a weed spraying reduction as well. So some of this is revenue driven activity where we our operator actually goes into surrounding municipalities and does some weed spraying. So we've kept that in there, but reduced the amount that we're doing within town here. And then there were some further public works restructuring strategies that we did. So that was total of $164,000, but it hit other departments in a significant way as well too. Just how we had the whole restructure and mapping done. So that's the major change in that one. Productive and governance. So we had a good review of the bylaw contract. I believe it was 28 hours that we were getting a week previously. We've reduced that down to 16. So again, this is taking a reactive approach, not a proactive approach to bylaw. So, primarily dealing with complaints and things that get brought up, as opposed to going around town, taking a look at, snow clearing on sidewalks, things like that. So, not a great change to go backwards from, but a necessary change. We had an assistant CO position elimination, so that was $150,000 savings. Office staff restructuring for a total of $180,000. And then we had a really good opportunity to share our planning resource with the town of Redwater, who I do work with as well too. So really excited for that to happen, and definitely a great cost savings that we can then utilize between both parties from there. So. Any questions, anything on any of those before I move on to our impact and outcomes? Charlotte?
I have a question. As far as the FCSS, we have cost sharing currently, don't we, with other municipalities?
Yes, there are some that were in there, but not enough to offset. So, for example, the seniors bus, we looked at opportunities to do some cost sharing in there. I haven't accounted for it in this budget because we don't have anything formalized. But yes, there are definitely some agreements that there's some cost sharing that happens for sure. You got something, Tim? Go ahead.
I guess my question is that will our reductions affect those intermunicipal agreements or the cost sharing agreements we currently have?
It's a good question. Through Mr. Mayor, in our opinion, the cost sharing agreements would be considered at a base level, and that base level of service for FCSS will still be maintained. We have provided a significantly higher level of FCSS services that's normal for a regional service of our type, and it's my understanding, and again, we've talked about this before with council, and again, the public needs to be aware, is my understanding is other municipalities have actually approached us offering to help pay for some of the FCSS, and it's been turned down by the previous administration. We will not be turning down opportunities to have our other supporting municipalities, and we are entering into those discussions with other municipalities right now. Now, are they bearing fruit just yet? Not yet, but they may. So that's where we're at right now. So we are trying to uncover some of those rocks to find some money if we can and if we can, we may still be able to maintain the services at that level. And that would be important to note. And I'll just leave you with this. We have been doing some homework on our FCSS, and we recognize that, yeah, our services are used by Sturgeon County, Bonnecourt primarily, and others. And I mean, some as far as away as Thorild. So that we do think there should be opportunities that we should pursue in relation to sharing. It's just sometimes these things take time.
Thank you.
My question was gonna be about, because I know that previously, like the previous council and all that, there were municipalities reached out offering to help with the services there. So I was gonna ask about that, if we're entering, negotiations again, if we're proactively, and you answered that, so. But I guess my next question is, and maybe there's no answer, but is there any logical reason whatsoever for the previous to turn down? Like, maybe you don't have an answer for that, but is there anything logical that they would say no, thank you?
Through Mr. Mayor, all kidding aside, again, I don't want to speak on and be unfair to the previous administration because I don't know what their rationale would be. But there is sometimes that we will turn down those type of opportunities in administration. It's normally around control and the expectation around agreements which will tie to, maybe changing the level of service or having kind of, I hate to say it, which can cause kind of political turmoil because of us no longer having control because we're not paying for it. That's the only thing I can think of, but I can't say that was the reason because we don't know the reason. I will say in a case like FCSS, I can't think of any reason personally why we would not welcome other municipalities that are using our service to help pay for the residents using our services.
Yeah, understood. Okay. Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
looking at the detail, if I was to summarize, through just about all services, when you are looking at your reductions, you're looking at the budget for 2026 against the budget for 2025, identifying the reductions. When we actually look at the actuals for 2025, they're significantly lower already because a lot of those reductions have already been put, those measures have already been put in place. That's a fair statement.
Absolutely.
So when we're looking at a reduction in services moving forward, we're looking at right-sizing our staffing in the town of Gibbons, moreover than anything, more that than actually removing an activity or a service.
Yes, to a point. There are some specific programs that we have, I don't want to say eliminated, but eliminated from the budget temporarily, to save a little bit of funding here and there. But yeah, I mean, the biggest thing for municipalities is 50 or more % of our budget is made up by salaries. So whenever we have to make changes, it's usually personnel related restructuring or changing of positions in that way. Yeah.
One of the things I think it's very important to note is you're bang on. We're not really looking at eliminating services per se. What we're looking at is, again, as you said, right sizing the staff. But I have to caution council and the public that we are basically getting down to where we would have is what I would call, kind of a minimalized staff, and we have to be very efficient and have to be very effective and very well managed to be able to provide the services at the same level. But that said, we believe we should be able to. But there's going to be work, but there also might be areas where, yeah, maybe we've gone a little bit too far, and we'll have to apologize to our public for maybe the snow isn't cleared as quick as, and maybe we're not cutting the grass at the same level anymore, whatever it might be. So we're entering into a new world. But again, we endeavor to provide the same services and hopefully at the same level. We're hoping, but there are going to be definitely certain areas where we're going to see a difference and a negative impact because we just don't have the same amount of people to deliver the services.
Yeah, and one of the other pieces I should add too is as we comb through the budget and go through the items, we look at in depth at that. But part of what I do is the trend analysis as well, and taking a look at the historical costs and what's the actuals look like. Are we padded in certain areas? Are we over budgeting? And the one thing I will say is yes, that was happening, and transparently more than it needed to for sure. We always like to have a little bit of contingency, but the level of contingency that existed made it easy to find some opportunities for savings for sure. Okay, anything else before I go? Nope. Okay. All right, so impact and strategic outcomes. So as Tim mentioned, the big thing with the organizational realignment would be a much leaner structure with clearer accountability. We're going to definitely have some implementation around performance reviews, performance management, that kind of thing. Reduced duplication. Impact would be around 10 positions in total. Significant transition planning obviously required for a lot of this. We would have quite a bit of positions changing, which would require, some retraining. We want to basically set it up so that when we have the restructure and have our personnel available, they can do more than just one thing. So we don't have just dedicated positions. We have crossover, we have cross training, we have people that can cover for each other for vacations or absences or vacancies. So that's one of the big pieces is while we're having to make it leaner and having to change things up, we want to build it back up the right way and look at how we grow the right way to make it so that in the long run, Gibbons can thrive without being dependent on certain individuals. So as noted, what this achieves with all of the changes that we've made is a structural operating balance. That was one of the big pieces. Was it looked like the budget was balanced, but it absolutely was not. So that's one thing that was key for us is coming in and building a balanced budget. The debt reduction was significant. And all credit to the province on coming to the table with that. That was one of the big things that loans to local authorities was really good to work with and get things in the works. Now, obviously, nothing's finalized as of yet, but we've taken the big steps that I feel comfortable budgeting for it. Hopefully, it doesn't shoot me in the foot. And reserve rebuilding potential is the one thing we would caveat that statement with is my focus more would be on looking at how we reduce the operating debt more so than the reserve building, but it'd be nice to do both, obviously. So that's one big piece, is trying to find opportunities and ways to reduce that operating debt eventually down to zero, but to give us a little bit of cash flow protection, I would say. So that's generally the purpose of our line of credits, is to allow us to make it through the lean times. So the times leading up usually to tax collection. So the months of April, May, June is usually when we kind of have to utilize lines of credit in order to just secure the cash flow for that major inflow incoming. But obviously it's gone through a very significant different approach in this case. So that would be one of the big focuses. And with a balanced budget comes our protection of municipal autonomy. So, as we balance the budget and get things onto the right level, then it shows that, while with the viability still ongoing, we've found ways that we can maintain viability, should that be the choice that it goes through. So as mentioned, just a summary of the major changes. So, we had our base budget challenge. We had some very significant deferrals, primarily debentures. So that was $883,000. Now these are all in the thousands. Our review corrections that we had, so $159,000 there, and then our cutbacks. So as Tim mentioned, they're not service level changes necessarily on these ones. This was our cutbacks on areas that we found that we could do that didn't have an impact to service levels. So that was $430,000, and then obviously the service level changes was the other big chunk of it. So that's where reduced services means we have to spend less money. So we had a total of $892,000 of changes in that area to get us to the current budgeted tax increase in the draft budget of $186,000. So 4.89% is what we got the number down to. This is just the total here, so it shows our total by objects, our revenue and expenses by objects. So we got everything plugged in. We've got our actuals comparators. We've got our 2025 budget comparators. Now, the one thing I'll note is we've excluded everything to do with reserve transfers at this point. There's no reserve transfers going in. There's no reserve transfers going out. So where the difference is in the $498,000, that should actually be $344,000 is down in the reserve transfer section. So just wanted to speak to that piece of it. But as noted, the total 2026 budget is balanced as it is, and the total tax revenue increase, as mentioned, was the $188,000 or $186,000. Any questions? Anything before I go through the highlights and observations?
Just one in regards to the deferrals that we got, like for the policing and the school board taxes. Is that in here?
It is, but in essence, for budgeting purposes, they don't matter because that was our cash flow saving.
Okay.
Yeah, so we pushed it out further basically for cash flow purposes, but they're still within the budget because we still have to pay them in the current year.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So highlights and observations. One big thing that Tim and I talked about, a lot with the experience we have in budgeting is this is definitely not a conventional budget. There are so many things that would be done differently in different situation, but we've kind of had our hands forced in what we're able to do, what we're able to strategize with, and the big goal for us was finding the balanced budget that is not a 20% tax increase. So that was the challenge, and again, not our normal focus when we come in to work on budgets, but something that intrigued us, I would say, I guess, is how we got there. So as noted, town debt's nearing its maximum. Cash reserves are completely depleted, so that would be a focus of the longer term strategy, and that's something that we wanted to nail home too, is what we've done for this year is still going to have to be worked on over the course of the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. So that's one big piece is we've had success in our 2026 budget now. And then the focus, obviously, once we finish this and get a budget passed, is how do we build in our long-term financial plan with the impacts that are going to get reintroduced over time. So as noted, the budget's a reset moment, which includes the implementation of a very significant amount of measures to bring us back on track financially. As I noted before, extensive review of historical results to make the budget corrections, and non-essential expenses with efficiency and effectiveness impacts were reduced. So professional development's one of those ones. Conferences, non-essential training. By non-essential training, we're talking about things that aren't required to maintain certifications and things like that. So these are things that are extremely important in a municipality. That's the one thing I will say is without professional development and training and learning, we don't get anywhere further ahead as a municipality. So that's something that we don't want to lose long term, but something that we can reduce in the short term. As well, significant reductions in certain consulting contracts and optional expenditures. So can't get too much into depth on those, but we've gone through and eliminated a very significant amount of contracts that existed in the 2025 budget, moving forward into 2026. Cutbacks in expenses that were deemed not to cause a long-term significant infrastructure or safety risk. So this is specific to mostly the changes we made in the public works area. So, obviously we recommended a bunch of reductions, but these reductions shouldn't result in significant infrastructure risks. So, obviously I say that, and we could have some type of major water main break or something like that. Can't budget for that right now with our current budget, so that's just something we'll have to tackle as it comes along. Big one here, numerous corrections to revenues that were overstated, so primarily in the land and development areas. One big thing with this is there is opportunity for this to materialize in a better way, but generally when that kind of thing happens, with land sales or these special levies that were budgeted for, those always are offset by reserve transfers generally. So normally we throw that money away into a reserve for future development, future costs, that kind of thing. So we've just straight not included it in the budget right now.
Just, one additional thing, just so council's aware. We were purposely very conservative in these areas. In the past, land and development charges were very aggressively put into the budget and didn't materialize, which resulted in deficits. We do see here there might be opportunity for development to come in, but our recommendation is to not budget for it. If it does come in, it's bonus. We put into reserve, and that comes to council for year-end, basically decision. And at that time, if it materializes, then we'd be recommending it goes to debt buy down and or put into reserve. But again, council has complete control of those numbers, administration doesn't, and this way we keep the municipality safe, but we balance for we plan for a balanced budget, and if it comes in bonus, that's a good thing, but this way we're safe.
Awesome, thanks. So as Tim mentioned, he just hammered the next point is, everything we did was the most extreme conservative approach we could take. We don't always go this route, but seemed especially prudent with the current situation that we wanted to be as conservative as possible and hope for some wins that we could materialize into other opportunities from there. So provincial deferrals of debt were incorporated into the base budget. One thing we haven't included in this budget is our provincial grants that were, accelerated for us through the province. So there's a $500,000 ACP grant that is currently not included in the budget, and the LGFF/CCBF grants that they're potentially going to allow us to forward fund to support operations is also not included in the budget right now. So those are some fairly significant numbers that we didn't want to include because we want to utilize them as we're able to target, some of the bigger changes that we want to do around reserve transfers or debt payment reductions, that kind of thing.
The other thing that's very important as well is that these were very welcome and appreciated grants that were provided by the province, but they're also one-time in nature. So when we're developing this budget in the elements of a long-term financial plan, we have to be able to depend on ourselves. So again, if we plan for these grants, and again, the province isn't going to guarantee that these are going to happen again, then they may not. We'd be in a very bad position to plan these into our base budget, and then we'd be again behind the eight ball with a 12% tax dollar increase, because that's what it's equivalent to for the 2027 budget. And so we felt it was prudent to leave them out at this time.
Yeah, and one thing specifically on the forward funding of the LGFF grants is that's not something that happens often, if ever. I've never actually seen that happen before, but it's not something we want to rely on because LGFF funds, I'd say 50 to 90% of our capital budgets generally. So we want to make sure we utilize those funds for capital, but obviously a special circumstance in this case. Fire services. So obviously everything ongoing with that. We're looking at trying to do a regionalization model, but with the current state, we have to budget for fire services at the status quo. So if we're able to do a regionalization model and whatever date we can make that effective, there would be some changes at that point, but not something we can budget for at this point in time. Outside of the organizational or the personnel level changes in the fitness center side of things, we've currently kept that included in the budget at its current state. And then, the service level reductions that were required to balance the budget have all been implemented and were based on the discussions that we had previously had. So risks, considerations, and council direction. Balancing the budget, as we noted, is the beginning. There are a lot more steps that need to get done and a lot more important decisions to be made. What we're going to prioritize around debt reduction, restricted and unrestricted surplus replenishment is going to be key in developing our longer term tax strategy and our longer term financial strategy. We have to make a longer term financial plan that reintroduces some of these so that, for example, the debenture repayments are going to increase in 2029 if they stay as forecasted. We're going to increase because we'll be reintroducing principal at that point, and then the ones in the following year would include full principal introduction, whereas it's not just one. So those are the types of things that we have to plan for in the longer term. So a 5 to 10 year plan is definitely going to be required, if not longer, but 5 to 10 years at the very shortest period is what we'll have to start working on and focusing on moving forward. That's everything I got before we get into the detail. Is there anything that council wants to talk about before we start talking departments, divisions from there? We can take a break as well too.
Councillor Morrison, if you could please get closer to your mic.
So both $500,000 grants, I always forget it,
LGFF and ACP.
ABC. So the ACP and the LG, thanks. Yeah, it's $1 million, not budgeted. And then potentially, should we see a regionalization of fire services, an additional 350,000 there. There's been no adjustment for the $36 million tax assessment increase in the area to tax, so that's an additional funding through the year.
Sort of. So the way that assessment works is we don't change anything tax revenue wise for assessment changes. It just changes how we set up the mill rates. So we don't forecast for tax revenue increases through it. But if there's growth, we can try and budget for that. Obviously not prudent in this situation, but any assessment changes just change how the mill rates are calculated.
Maybe I'll explain, because I get this question quite often. Assessment fluctuations, increases are never increases to taxation from a real dollar perspective. And the reason why is I bought my first house in the year 2000. I can still remember looking at my mortgage and thinking I bought a house for $160,000 and thinking I'm never going to be able to pay this off. And thinking to myself, I should have waited until the house prices went down. 2 years later, that same house was worth $320,000. Did my taxes double? No. So basically, when the assessment doubles, we cut the mill rate in half, basically, because again, we always, with the assessment will go up. We only will collect what we should be collecting from a total dollar perspective for the budget. Where assessments matter is basically against the average household within the community. So whether your taxes fluctuate up and down, it's because of they're measuring your taxes or your assessment against the average home within the community. So assessment fluctuations going up are never taken advantage of from a real property revenue perspective. And maybe I'll just because again, I know it's confusing. 2008, 2009, the municipal mortgage crisis in the United States. So imagine if everybody's assessment or house prices went down by half and every municipality's revenues were cut in half because of assessments. It would be a disaster. So we always filter it out. It's called a concept called market neutrality.
I like to do simple Cape Breton math. Our tax base, simple Cape Breton math, 3.7 million.
No problem.
Okay? That's what it was for 2026. Based on 36, I can't remember what the total amount was, but 36 million less in tax assessment value, right? So are we collecting 3.7 million again in 2026, or are we collecting 3.7 million, but we've also increased our assessed value?
Go ahead.
That's why I'm confused.
So what you have is you have assessment fluctuations, but then we have what's called real growth. So actual houses being built, yes. So if it's actual homes being built, real growth, we do generate additional revenue from that. Yes.
Okay, so that's my point.
Yeah.
So increased tax base based on growth. Okay, super. And that growth this in this year, 25 to the 26th year, looks to be approximately $36 million. So what I'm saying is, I looked at the roll. I might be off, but and so that becomes a little bit of a kitty. I guess that's what I'm really looking at. Is I'm saying, okay, we've got $1.3 million in the 2 grants plus potential for fire services, and then we've got an additional growth increase in revenue. So all of that, I'm all for balancing the budget. I'm just saying that is great news in looking at downpaying our debt down the road. So that's where I'm coming from with this, is that we'll tighten our belts, we'll balance our budget, but we also are moving forward with debt repayment.
Through Mr. Mayor, you're bang on. One of the things that we want to make sure that's very clear, this is a conservative budget. Because of what's happened here in the past, we want to take a very prudent and careful perspective moving forward. But we do have the $500,000 ACP, the $500,000 LGFF. We have potential for development revenue that we may realize that we weren't sure of, that we may or may not get. That'd be about $1.5 million. And then if we can tighten our belts with as we're going through the year and basically find other savings, if everything worked out well, we could maybe have $1 million, $1.5 million that we could put towards putting money in the bank. And that's our goal. That's part of it's not just about setting a budget. It's about managing things throughout the year. And that's one of the big goals, is to not overspend, but really tighten our belts, not just in the way we budget, but the way we actually spend money during the year. Yeah. Very good point.
Yeah, the big thing around taxation revenue and assessment is the linkage is there, but when it comes down to it, when we are calculating the mill rates and doing everything, we only calculate the exact amount of what we've budgeted for tax revenue. So we don't collect more. It's all just based on what the budgeted tax revenue requirement is for that year.
When it comes down to the mill rating, who actually decides the mill rating? I know that we set the mill rating, but where does the figure come from? Because my understanding, it kind of comes from an outside source as a here's where it should be, and then we kind of go based on that guideline. Is that correct, or
No? So mill rate calculations is just a a function of what our tax rate revenue requirement is, so the dollar amount required divided by the total assessment in each different class, basically. So a mill rate is set by class, so you take, this is how much we need to make, this is what the assessment amount is, this is what the mill rate is as a result. So that's how the mill rate's calculated, and then it's just applied to the assessment of each individual, which is how you calculate the total taxes for that one. So it's driven by calculation, but council has the ability to change prioritizations, to maybe adjust split rates, to make changes in that way. So mill rates can be modified slightly, but for the most part, it's just purely calculation based.
Did you guys need a break? Are you okay? Continue to plug? Complete to plug away? Okay, recess for 5 minutes.
abided by, to get it to tax rate notices. And so, we wanted to provide you with this information. If there's questions tonight, great. If there's not, we'll come back and answer questions at another time.
So just give me, I'll go first.
Well, you're the mayor.
I got a question in regards to, the first question I have, and then I'll pass it on and it'll come back to me, is the fitness center question. On the earlier slide, you mentioned that you reduce it by 40K or 44K, I think. But it shows that, we still anticipating a 70, I can't find which one that's under there, a $74,000 loss or $77,000 loss?
Fitness center will be under Parks and Rec.
Parks and Rec, okay.
But I should note, fitness center is one department within Parks and Rec. That includes, going off the top of my head, arena. There's a few that go into it.
Yeah, I think I was specifically looking at maybe that was the package you guys sent us earlier, where it was separated on its own.
Yeah.
You're right at the 74.
At 74. So the question is, well, you have that open there. The question is
Sorry, Your Honor, nobody in live stream.
okay, sorry. So the question is the 40,000 that you talked about earlier, is that reflected in still showing the $74,000 loss?
Correct.
Or would it be only 34,000?
No, it's in there. Yeah.
It's still in there, right?
Yeah.
Okay, seems a fair bit of money to lose. Any idea, user numbers?
Nothing available as of right now, but we can definitely get membership numbers and things like that for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
The one thing I would note on it is there's a lot of rec programs that almost will never make
Correct.
a surplus, right? So in actuality, a $74,000 loss on a gym, for example, is not a ton when you look at some of the other ones. Yeah, it's not an unusual number. So
Yeah. I think
it's not ideal, but
yeah, no, agreed, but, the must-haves and the nice-to-have kind of
Yes.
thing, and that's kind of falls in those nice-to-have category aspect of it.
it was one that we didn't necessarily want to exclude at this point, but we wanted to have council have the opportunity to say, no, let's get rid of it for now, and then look at reintroducing it later. So it's still one that's on the table to do reductions on for
Okay.
sure.
Thank you. Councilor Curry?
Yeah, I've been in touch with Jen, who runs the gym, and I'm trying to be proactive in seeing what we can do there. She's been keeping track of numbers, like as far as busy times, and the memberships and all that kind of stuff. So we had a talk on the phone a few nights ago, and she has all that type of information. She's working on cutting some things, like they had cable there and the whole, fancy whatever. She's cutting all that stuff. She cut her own pay. We just talked about all that stuff, so I'm actually wanting to see if we can have her in to have some discussions and see what we can do with. But I just wanted to kind of throw that out there that she's willing to cooperate, and she does have numbers and all that stuff to kind of focus on.
Mr. Mayor, if I could address the question or comment. Willing to cooperate. I think the reality is we have to make some tough decisions, and so I think it's about a collaborative approach to things, as she is kind of a contracted employee through the town. I will say this is that I did receive a message from I think this individual this week. Couldn't get back to her just yet, but we did plan. I talked to the rec team. I went and met with them this week, and I did commit to meeting with the recreation or the gym staff and looking at alternatives. Now we're talking about using a POB system, monitoring the gym from a computer monitor by an individual at certain times, cutting down on hours. And so there was, again, a lot of ideas that were thrown out. We knew that this was an important service for council from your perspective in terms of whether we should be doing this or not, and we are looking at additional alternatives to save money. That said, we are also concerned about risk associated with leaving a gym unattended and all those types of things, and unattended from a theft perspective, a damage to material perspective, but also risk for somebody getting hurt in the gym while we're not there. And so there's a lot of things that we're considering. But again, all good questions and things that we can address before the end of the budget period. Yeah.
Counselor Brack?
When I'm looking at it, and it says contracted services were actually up 35% in this budget. We're up by 295,511 and change. I know we're making other cuts, but what are the contracted services increase? Where's that coming from, or how's that number being arrived at?
That would be a big portion of it is sitting right in front of you right here. So normal personnel costs are contracted service at this point in time. So that's a big piece of it is the contracts that we've got going on for our director position and the CAO position. So that would be one of the major drivers for sure. We have also looked at some contracted services to support things like snow clearing and things like that where, you know, eliminating some of the capability of our staff members requires us to still provide backup for the services.
Maybe if I may also answer this question is again, being very transparent with council and to the public, we are looking at an exit strategy for Bloom. You're going to eventually want to hire your own chief administrative officer. We recognize that. Where you're seeing the change here is also we removed the contracted services from staffing into contract for your former CAO. And the former CAO salary plus benefits was, I think, in excess of about $260 altogether, I believe. And so that is in here. And though we are looking at and recommending that the assistant CEO position be removed and I be removed from this situation here in the coming months, we felt it was prudent to have some contracted services in place for your new CEO, plus additional work that you may require from other contractors over time. And so leaving you some opportunity for basically needs for services.
Counselor St. Germain?
Okay. So under Public Works, there's a lease. Says leases $16,000. Is that the vac truck? Do we know what's happening with the vac truck? Where is the vac truck?
I'm just kidding.
It's not the vac truck, no. No, it's not. So let me get to it here. So what you're seeing in there is the difference from the 2025 budget to the 2026 budget. What they've included in previous years is the renewal of the 3-year cycle of I think it's the skid steers. So there's a renewal that goes through every third year for the $16,000. So it's something that's not included in this year's budget. The lease of the vac truck is in the sewer department, so it'll be in the utilities.
And before we leave that, I read in the comment there that contract is coming up in 2026. Is it the vac truck contract, the lease contract?
Yeah.
Is that the attachment I read to that?
If I may, because I know the vac truck is a sticking point for everybody. Again, we have looked at getting a second and third vac truck. Again, I'm kidding. But all kidding aside, I wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night thinking about vac trucks now. But we are looking at a few options again of the lease, and we're doing the calculations on having a contractor come and pick up the sewage without us actually having the vac truck. We're looking at the possibilities of owning our own vac truck. With the lease cost that we've put out over the last couple of years, we could have bought one. So we are looking at all of these things. We will have a solution, we promise you, by the end of this, but it's a work in progress. And so we're on top of this, and we will have a recommendation before this budget is completed. It will not be to lease a vac truck continually in perpetuity going forward.
Counselor Longstaff?
Yeah, under corporate services, it shows that the 2025 budget was allocated $3.7+ million, and the 2026 budget, it only has 262,000 for revenue.
That's the taxes. That's your tax difference. So we included that in the totals, but I didn't have it plugged into the individual departments. But that's the main change there is the tax.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Curry?
Just a comment and then a question. Comment is if my other counselors would all get memberships at the gym with me. But, so I have a question and
Did you just call us fat?
saying we could keep the gym going if you all would join me. I'll give you free, training or whatever you want. CPR. And then just a question regarding the non-residential tax rates. I think I know the answer, but I'm gonna ask it just because I'm looking at this and we're kind of in the middle of, so if that, if like Thor Hill 21, Bon Accord 19, Legal basically 19, to raise that, is there, you can't like raise it on say a big like corporation, like a big, like say, just say NW or Tim Hortons or something like that, and then keep it lower for say, a small business locally on Main Street. Like you can't.
You can. Under the new legislation, this occurred about 4 or 5 years ago. There's considered big business versus small business. Now there's metrics around that. So it's based on number of employees, revenue, that whatnot. But you can have a split, a secondary rate, which is commercial, and you can charge a higher rate for what we consider maybe higher revenue type businesses. It's not overly employed across Alberta. It's very controversial. It's very difficult to implement, but it can be done. Maybe further to this, just to, again, this is information that we provided with council last time. The provincial average on the most part, if you kind of flip between these two, Ryan, you can see the 8.064, and if you look at the next one is the 1.4998. That gives you a split rate of 8 to 14, and the average on the most part is usually 2 to 1. So that should be, if we're looking at the provincial average, you'd be looking at about 16 to 17 as a mill rate. But again, that's a provincial average. It doesn't mean that there's a science behind that. The maximum you can go to is 5 to 1. So, and I would never recommend that because business will be very upset with you. But there are arguments that yours is a little bit slightly below the provincial average at this time.
One other note on that as well, too, specific to the small business subclass, is it's based on that specific business. So Tim Hortons, for example, each location is a separate business, so they wouldn't fall under the large business subclass. So I'd say probably 95% of your businesses in town are going to fall under the small business subclass when it comes down to it, because there's not a lot of industry.
Councillor Brack?
I do know that there's a lot of home-based businesses around town. That has nothing to do with a home-based business, correct?
No, the home-based businesses are allowed for as residential property still. They're not usually classed as commercial. It can happen where that happens. So if you have a split-use residence, for example, so someone who maybe has a larger property and they have their residence and then they have, say, a big garage or a shop and they operate a business out of that, sometimes the assessors will catch that and will do a split use of the property, but very, very rare for sure.
Burak's backyard yoga is safe, buddy. Don't worry.
Where some municipalities do take advantage and look for additional revenues through business licensing for small home-based type of businesses. Calgary, for one, is a kind of a pioneer in this and have done very well with their business licensing revenues. But again, it challenges, again, business in your community. And so it's, again, controversial to implement.
Before we go for more questions, sorry, I have to correct my answer for Councillor Longstaff's question. That's not taxes in the corporate services one, sorry. That's the land sales and the special tax levy. Yeah, and then there was another line for development charges, offsite levies specifically. as a line as a revenue, which absolutely cannot do. So that's the culmination of a bunch of land development or planning, I guess I would say, revenues that were eliminated. The taxes are on the corrections. The taxes are on the tax department.
Question under utilities, contracted services, GFL, waste pickup. The contracted in with them, is there a possibility of reduction to a biweekly pickup?
We can absolutely look at some service reductions on that note. The one thing I will note is, I forget how many years ago it was, but there was a big RFP that had gone out for a bunch of the municipalities in the area that did, for GFL specifically, or for waste removal, I guess I should say. But GFL severely knocked down their numbers across the board. So, you know, we're quite advantageous on what we've got for a contracted service. The one thing that I'll say in this as well too is included in this contracted service is actually the contractor who does the sewage removal. So we've got the cost for the lease itself on the sewer truck, the vac truck, but there's also a cost for the operator, which is a contracted service as well too. So that's included in this as well. It's not just purely the GFL contract.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but are we not paying some farmer guy to come out to drive the vac truck?
That I can't speak to that. I only ever see the invoices come through, but it's
Yeah.
it's invoiced through a business.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's K something ranch,
Something, Triple K stables.
yeah,
okay, stables.
so, but he's connected with GFL?
No. Sorry, I was saying that's another contracted service that's included.
I
It's
see.
not just GFL.
Not just GFL,
Yeah.
yeah. All right,
Sorry.
Yeah.
okay. Oh, okay, so it's more than just the one. Yeah, okay. Thanks. Anybody else? I'll go on to the next one. Probably, I would imagine it falls under FCSS, the museum. Have we looked at doing anything at the museum?
In the budget right now, I've kept the museum as status quo. So there's no major reductions outside of, I should caveat, there were some capital costs that were included in 2025's budget that were going to be contributions to capital out of the operating budget. So those were eliminated, but outside of that, there was not a major change in the museum.
Okay. Councillor St. Germain?
Under revenue and expense by object utilities, we had a user fee that was supposed to go for future infrastructure on everybody's bill, and I'm wondering, is that in here? That because my understanding is we have to repay that money because it went into general coffers and not into a restricted account. Is that in here, that, or do we have to repay it? How does that work?
Through Mr. Mayor, great question. Ryan and I had discussions about this. I plan to talk about this evening. At this time, our recommendation is to, if we remove the special levy, all we're going to end up doing is increasing the utility rate to offset it. And so in the end, the revenues stay the same. So the utility charge to the ratepayer, it's been unchanged. Do we have to pay it back? We may. Again, here's the thing. If there was a special levy and it was guaranteed to go into long-term capital planning, which is basically a capital reserve is my understanding, we need to put that money into basically that reserve. That is an absolute must that we have to do. I've looked at the utility bills. I've seen the rate. And we need to do it. We've agreed. We're just not in a financial position to do it at this time, but we will make the commitment that if we have surplus, that's probably one of the number one things that we'd probably say to this council. Our recommendations would be to make that payment into the reserve and replenish the tax or the utility payers with the levy that they've actually put in. To reduce it though at this time would mean basically just an offsetting utility rate increase.
Sorry, I just meant like the repayment, and I just don't want something coming up and biting us when we know that should have been put into a restricted account.
As mentioned, it should be a restricted account. We don't have any funds to replenish it at this time, nor do we have any funds to basically do any kind of a rebate program. But like I said, like we're hoping to manage it this year, and it was something that Ryan and I have talked about that we need to basically highlight, be transparent with the public that we recognize this and we need to fix this by the end of the year.
Counselor Breck?
In regards to that utility with that fee, I know it's been brought up to me by a few, citizens as well. Why don't we just call it what it is and just call it an extra charge?
Yeah, realistically, it can be spread however we want on the utility invoices. I personally would just eliminate the rate rider for capital reserve for this point in time and just say that this is a fee when it comes down to it. Yeah, because in actuality it is at this point in time. So one of the big things that I want to get done, as Tim mentioned, over the year is a big utility rate review. We'll go in and take a look at everything, find comparators, and make some recommendations. But as we mentioned, it's, that's something that we can try and build into the financial plan, but it's not something we can get taken care of in the 2026 budget for sure.
Counselor St. Germain?
I'm not sure if I can ask this here, so I'm gonna try and see if I get stopped. It's my understanding that we gave interest-free loans, to private citizens. Can we recall them?
Through Mr. Mayor, you can't ask that question here, so we'll just move on. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. You have the answer.
Yes. So, yes, they do exist. What I will say is the structuring of them was inappropriate. They generally get done as a local improvement levy, but an actual local improvement levy. So, if the one case that I know of specifically was to upgrade an alley, generally we would include that as a local improvement levy that would get charged on the taxes. So it would continue. Setting it up as a interest-free personal loan to the owner at that point in time introduces significant risk in that if ownership changes, that does not transfer with a new owner. So my understanding is those are mostly finished at this point in time. There's not a lot that's left on those, so I don't think that there's any recall that we can do on them necessarily, but they definitely are something that won't happen moving forward for sure.
Is there any way that we can, because you said they would be a improvement levy, could we transfer them so that we can secure them?
Not off the work that's done. We can't necessarily re-levy for it later on. So once it's once the work's been completed, and like I said, the vast majority of what I've seen of those loans that existed were more or less repaid. There were maybe one or two that still had a year or two, but we're not talking big dollars when it comes down to those. They're very drastically reduced for sure.
Thank you.
Anybody else? So the question be if we, going forward from here, this is just the first stage. Do we, I guess we need a motion.
So before we go, I'll add something in. So one of the things that Tim introduced this one to me originally, but we do what we call a flagged item process. So all the things that are noted in the meeting are brought up, and we document them, and then we bring the answers to the following one. So as more questions and inquiries come up, please submit them, email, however, whatever form. We'll include them in the flagged item list because it's something that we will talk about at the next budget meeting. So we don't necessarily need all the questions now, but as they come up, feel free to submit them and we'll include them and review them as part of the flagged item process for the next budget meeting.
Okay, so I guess the question would be, sorry Travis, I'm gonna bring it up again, is the fitness center. To whether or not we choose to keep it open or shut it down temporarily, or look at trying to attract a private service to run it instead of us.
Through Mr. Mayor, there's a number of things that we're still kind of negotiating, discussing with fitness centers, with other municipalities in terms of sharing, supporting services. That, again, will be kind of generating more information for council with, but again, yeah, we can come back at any time and answer those questions. What we are looking for, though, is, again, remember, it is kind of a council direction. When we say council direction, there may be things that you decide to put to a vote during the council budget process where you say, we may not be in agreement that we want to keep the gymnasium open or not, whatever it might be. And then we say, well, we need a motion then, and then we need that direction.
Right.
Because again, we need strong direction from council about how you feel about these things.
And basically, that was kind of my question.
Yep.
Is that something we would do tonight to take,
If you
this being our first budget for all of us here, right? So,
Yeah, so what our thought was is because it is the first budget process this council's gone through, is to hand the information off tonight, let it percolate a little bit, and then provide you with additional time and meetings where we could then, you could maybe ask those questions, send to us, and then we'll set up the next meeting with the flagged items with questions answered and maybe some motions to ask council, okay, we need a strong direction on this issue, whether it be gymnasium, back truck, whatever it might be. So that's the process,
okay,
giving you time.
and getting into that, it was mentioned earlier that possibly looking at a key fob process over there, and that's gonna be
Yep.
an added cost to it. So I guess for the next budget meeting coming back forward, have those numbers for us so we can determine whether or not it makes sense to leave it open or to close it.
We have a fob system I found that would work already over there.
It's already installed
Yes,
already?
it is, yeah.
Okay.
So that's already, what I would want is, at least, if we're gonna say have it unmonitored, we'd wanna have it with some type of a screen system where every 15 minutes, some staff member is looking to see if somebody has fallen or,
Because there's a liability review.
yes,
liability aspect
that's
to
the
that
key
point,
thing. And
right?
so we're looking at basically the very bare bones option versus, full staffing option, right? So we are looking at those things, and so we wanna come back with that. And a number of other options that we wanna bring forward for your consideration as well.
Counselor Saint Germain?
There's some things you just can't unsee, so, yeah.
Have we contacted, our insurance provider to see what the liability is with having the fob system? Just,
Not yet. It's something we put as our notice to follow up on, but we haven't done that yet. Councillor Sherman, thank you.
Nobody else? Okay, can I get a motion, please? Do you want me to read out the motion you wanted to say?
No, we want council to make its own
That's correct,
motion,
yes.
not the mayor giving the words.
Counselor Simonowitz?
I'd like to move that council receive the 2026 preliminary budget presentation as information.
Any further questions on that? All those in favor? Carried? Unanimous? Do you want to do the second motion as well?
Did council want to include that direction to provide more detail on the gym cost memberships and alternatives to keeping it open?
I think in the number 2 kind of spells that out for us.
Well, it just says to advise administration, so if you don't provide some clear direction to administration, you're just saying, we advise you, yep, just go with what we said. You have to provide a little bit of direction to administration.
I see. Okay, sorry. So, did you got that?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. Okay, I move that council provide direction, I guess specifically in regards to the operation of the gym, and do some fact-finding on that, on adjustments to the 2026 budget, and that administration be directed to take action as identified during the meeting.
Any questions? All those in favor? Carried unanimous? And I believe that is it. 21:41, meeting adjourned.